It's Monday, December 9th, 2024. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Documenting Congress Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm on the campus of California State University Channel Islands, and I'm joined by Dr. Sean Q. Kelly, who is professor of political science here. Prior to taking his current post, Dr. Kelly taught political science at the University of Colorado, East Carolina University, and Niagara University. He earned a bachelor's degree from Seattle University and his MA and PhD in political science from the University of Colorado Boulder. A former American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow, he worked for the Senate Democratic Leadership in 1993 and 1994. His research interests include American political institutions, political parties and leadership, as well as public policy. He is co-author of Committee Assignment Politics in the U.S. House of Representatives, Jimmy Carter and the Water Wars, and Cheese Factories on the Moon, Why Earmarks Are Good for American Democracy, the winner of the Ashton Prize for Best Title in Political Science. In addition to this scholarship, he has been an active member of the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. So thank you, Dr. Kelly, Sean, so much for taking an afternoon out of your finals week to talk about your career and time documenting the work of Congress.
Sure.
So tell me about your childhood and upbringing. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Seattle, Washington, America's greatest city. And, small family, but deep roots there, including my lifelong love of sports. I saw the first Mariners game. I saw the first Seahawks game. I saw a very early Seattle Sonics game. So I have a great deal of love for my hometown. I don't get there as much as I want, and I certainly don't live there. I grew up there. I went to 4 of Seattle's several high schools, one after another, not doing very well, frankly, not going very often, really. And part of that goes to the fact that I just didn't like the way I was being taught. I felt like in high school I was being told, it was being given a set of facts that I thought that I needed to then give back, and I really wanted to learn how to think. High school wasn't giving me that. There are a lot of other reasons too, but so I actually wound up graduating from an alternative high school. Most of that year I spent going to cooking school, so I'm actually a certified cook.
What's your cuisine?
I'm more of a get it done kind of cook. So my favorite class was for large groups.
Okay.
I think it was called industrial cooking. So I like making a lot of stuff.
Okay.
I'm not so much somebody who's into putting little leaves on top of things.
Yeah, I don't want to leave hungry, so you're my guy.
Yeah. It was by way of that program that I found my way into a couple of college classes at a community college. And when I took those classes, I said, whoa, this is what I like. I was not getting from high school what I wanted to get from college, which is this bigger idea of, connecting ideas to each other, making arguments, providing evidence, that sort of thing. And that's how I got into college was, I started with, general education requirements at another community college, and then finally was able to get a grade point average that would get me into college because my high school graduating GPA was 2.17. And that was thanks to my grades in cooking classes. So, I am not a poster child for how people are supposed to do it, so I kind of found my way back, and then decided, like 2-3 quarters into the community college. I'm like, well, I want to be a college professor. This looks like a good deal. And part of the reason for leaving cooking school was that I realized how much work it was. And at 18, I said, oh my God, how am I going to do this when I'm 30? And
Standing on your feet for 16 hours a day.
but when I saw these college professors, I'm like, oh man, that looks like a pretty sweet deal. You know, it looks like easy work, and in a lot of ways, you know, because I love it as much as I do, in a lot of ways it is easy work. You know, it's intellectually difficult, but at least I can still stand up straight. Only one back surgery. So.
Well, how do you go from, you've decided that cooking isn't necessarily the path forward, but you get into Seattle University, a Jesuit school, very rigorous liberal arts college in Seattle. How do you wind up on this path towards political science?
The story I tell my students, and it's true, is that actually it was about my second quarter in college and I took an economics class. I had an interest in politics. I had taken an intro political science course during my first quarter, and it was supremely boring. And you know, but I found the topic interesting. I took this economics course and I got to the end of it. I really enjoyed it. Thought I might do economics, and I got to the end. I was like, you know, if I want to understand why certain economic policies get made, then why study economics? I should go to politics, which is where those decisions are made. And this is the early 80s, so, you know, I'm thinking, you know, we're getting early Reaganomics. I'm looking at this as a, you know, 18, 19-year-old jerk and going, wow, this is a big ripoff. There's no basis for this. And so that's what sort of got me started in political science. But the first couple of classes I took, I didn't care for. And it wasn't until I took my comparative politics class with Brad Scharf at Seattle University that the light just kind of went on. And I'm like, you know, it was a comparative politics class. The way that he set it up was very empirically minded, and I tend to be a person who's pretty analytical most of the time, unless I'm watching sports. You know, then I lose it from time to time. But you know, yeah, he was very analytical. I was very analytical, and that was the sort of approach that I was looking for. And so from there on out, despite any weaknesses I had from my previous education, I'm like, yeah, this is what I want to do. And in fairly short order, you know, was able to go off to grad school and do that after taking a year off to work in an espresso shop, which is what you do when you're from Seattle.
I was getting ready to say, are you even from Seattle if you haven't worked in a coffee shop?
Yeah, a bookstore too.
Oh, wow. So tell me about the decision-making process on deciding on the University of Colorado.
Interesting question. So I had applied to a few places.
Sure.
I didn't really know what I was doing. It was before the internet. You had very little information. And so I applied to several places, mostly based on Brad Scharf's advice.
Sure.
So I applied, basically I got into two places that I was serious about thinking about. One was Colorado and the other one was Washington University. And Washington University, then as it is now,
Washington, St. Louis?
Yeah,
Okay.
was, you know, the higher ranked department. It would have made sense to go there. But I don't do anything without visiting first. And so I went to St. Louis. And it was very foreign to me. I was born in the West. I was raised in the West. There's a certain Western way of life. And when I went to St. Louis, I started for the first time to get a taste of Southern life. Now realizing that Missouri is not technically a southern state, but I got just certain body clues from people in the city that sort of said, this isn't really the place for me. But it was the higher ranked place.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so I went home from that trip, and there was a message for me from a guy named Ted Gurr at the University of Colorado. And he said, they had let me in, they'd made me an offer. And I said, well, I think I'm going to go to WashU. And he said, well, why don't we fly you down here and you take a look around and you see what you think. And I had been to Boulder before, and it's beautiful. But on that trip, I got a chance to meet him, and he was, one of the giants of political science. So I met him. He was very nice. The faculty that I met were really engaging, unlike WashU. And I also got a chance to meet with and talk and stay with the graduate students, and I felt much more comfortable there. And that's when I met Larry Dodd. We had a nice long talk, and he has a sort of a touchy-feely quality to him that makes me very comfortable. And so we just hit it off right away. So I totally changed my mind. I said, I'm going to Colorado. I had second and third thoughts about that because, even back in the 80s and early 90s, the job market wasn't that great for academics. And so, I did worry about it, but I managed to come out the other side, doing reasonably well. And so for me, it's always about personal relationships and feeling comfortable with what I'm doing over most anything else.
Well, tell me, selecting a grad school is obviously a huge decision, but another, and probably the most important decision we make once in graduate school is the subject of your dissertation.
Yeah.
And how did you, I assume based on what you've already told me, this was a series of conversations with those same gentlemen and women who were your professors and your colleagues. Is that how your dissertation topic sort of took shape?
It's weird because I did write my dissertation proposal. It was quite lengthy, and it was actually focused on state level politics. And yada, yada, yada. A book came out called Divided We Govern,
Yes.
David Mayhew's book.
Yes.
And I read it, and I didn't buy it. It didn't make sense to me. Here he is making the argument that it doesn't matter if you have united party government or divided party government, you're gonna get laws passed. And what he did, he had a list in the back of the book of the laws that he was working from and how he had made that list. So he'd gone through, probably a graduate student had gone through, the Washington Post and the New York Times to look at columns, year-end columns. Here's what Congress, did this year. So he took that as part of the list, and then the other one was to, search the Yale libraries for books about public policies. The argument being, if somebody took the time to write a book, it must be something that's important. And I don't quibble with either one of those things. But then he put them together as a single list. And my logic was this. If a law is mentioned at the time that it's passed as being something that's important, and then it gets a book, well, that seems to me to be an important law, because people could see things in real time and say, oh, this is important, and then 10 years later, nobody cares. And so I said, well, what if you only took the ones that met both of those criteria? And lo and behold, if you do that and you use his same model, you come to the opposite conclusion, which is that divided party government produces too fewer laws per Congress than united government does, which made more sense based on the literature that I had been reading throughout this graduate school experience. And so what wound up being my dissertation, this what turned into an article, was to build around that and to try to find other ways to figure out if divided government made a difference. Because at the time, the people were all over the place. Oh yeah, it matters. No, it doesn't matter. And so that was published. David Mayhew responded to it, and then I responded to him. So it, as a first major publication, it was a really big deal, because here's a guy at Yale who's taking his grad students seriously, and to his credit and my benefit, he wrote me a letter of recommendation for the Congressional Fellowship, basically saying, hey, give this guy a chance.
A gentleman and a scholar.
Yeah. So, so in that sense, through that one little act, helped me to push my career forward quite a ways. So the dissertation was really about, united and divided government. It's not very good, but for its time, it is what it was. I mean, because my generation of scholars are the first to have, computers on their desks and software on those computers to be able to do data analysis, whereas before that was, the mainframes across the street and, the VAX terminal and all that. So, in that sense, it was, sophisticated's the right word, but it was quantitative, and I wanted to do something quantitative.
Going back to that analytical approach.
Yeah, which is, again, surprising because I'm very much also a humanist, and so, when I went to grad school, and I tell my students this all the time, I was scared of statistics. I didn't want to do that. I wasn't a natural for that kind of thing. But it was really statistics in service to the questions in politics that I was really interested in. That's what got me.
It means to it.
Yeah, I'm more of a person who learns well by doing things rather than by being told, here's how you would do it if you were to do it. That makes no sense to me. And so that's how I teach now, too.
Well, tell me about that congressional fellowship, because there's so many different folks I've talked to who are congressional scholars who started out in their post-grad career as APSA congressional fellows, and how that has really sort of shaped their career based on what they learned they loved or learned they didn't want to do.
Yeah.
So tell me about your own personal experience, 93, 94, working on health policy?
Yeah, health policy, and that's,
How timely.
Yeah, it turned out to be, because that was, of course, the Clinton healthcare plan. Yeah. But the assignment there, so when you're a fellow, they'll give you a list of offices that have said, we would be open to this. Mm-hmm. And my first impulse, and I think it says something about congressional politics generally, was, oh, well, I'm going to work in the House, and I'm going to work for, a leadership office or somebody who's involved in the Rules Committee or something like that. That was Steve Smith's work on the Rules Committee was, was very current at the time. And, so yeah, he's at WashU, so they give you a list, but you can go anywhere you want to. And on the list, I saw the Democratic Policy Committee in the Senate, and of course, I was House focused, like so many people in the field are. And I didn't know what the policy committee was. I quickly figured out what it was, because leadership in the Senate really still, I think, hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And I thought, well, this is a good thing for me. So I got the interview. They said, well, we'll be working, and you would be working on health policy. I, of course, know nothing about health policy, but, and again, another story that I tell my students all the time is, here's the thing, my bachelor's degree and my PhD, those prepared me to learn. And so it didn't take me very long to read myself into what I had to know to be able to do that job, which was largely on the communications side of that operation at the time. There was the legislative side and there was the communication side, and so I was more on the communication side. But what it did for me, which I think is unusual, is that because it was a leadership office, I would see all the senators together, rather than seeing my one senator, my one House member coming in and out and doing things from that perspective. And so in a way, it kind of changed my perspective because so much of the literature speaks to, members of Congress want to get reelected. They're single-minded seekers of reelection. And if you're sitting in a member's office, that is how you would see the institution. You might see, they go to their committee meeting and they come back. But in those senators' meetings, that's where you saw them interacting with one another and discussing the bigger issues of how to move forward on X, Y, or Z. And so I think the idea, the reason that idea is so sticky, the one of members being single-minded seekers of reelection, is it's very easy to see them that way because all of the ways in which they're going to be most visible is from that perspective. And I, of course, I have complete respect for Mayhew and that simple assumption. However, I think that members of Congress, like regular human beings, are much more complicated. And while they may have, the goal to be reelected or to help their constituents, they also are normal human beings who want to be intellectually engaged, who want to, be pulling on the levers of power, those kinds of things. And that's how I was trained by Larry. One of the best essays he's ever written is Congress and the Quest for Power, which was a response to Mayhew. Seeing it from Larry's point of view, or more importantly, Richard Fenno's point of view, as sort of a more complete way of thinking about these people, that to me, the fellowship experience solidified that idea that we're talking about something more than simply wanting to get themselves reelected. Again, footnote, I understand that Mayhew says that that's not their only motivation. He says, what if it's their only motivation? But our field largely moved past that to that's an actual empirical fact. And I think we're far from establishing that. That said, I have some ideas on the way that Republicans behave but I won't go into those.
Well, I mean, if you could figure it out, I think people will be willing to pay top dollar in our current political moment.
Yeah, I guess to put it quickly, I think that Republicans have become the automatons that Mayhew theorized. So they have become the single-minded seekers of reelection. And so we see the kind of much more symbolic behavior among Republicans. They're not interested in policy. They're interested in raising money and exercising power. And So re-election figures right into the center of that. Say something crazy in your committee hearing, go back to the office and send out a fundraising appeal. But the thought that they are much interested in actually making policy the nuts and bolts, it's mostly missing, and appropriations is a perfect example of that. Sure, Democrats had a dysfunctional process, but there was some process there. Now it's just continuing resolution after omnibus appropriation. There's very few attempts to actually try to make policy.
It's really interesting, and this is a divergent from what we're talking about, but it's fascinating to consider. It is in the 80s when you're coming up and you're talking about parties and committees and laws will get passed and this is during a period where you have ideologically diverse parties, less so on the Republican side, but still
yeah.
There are some there with your Clifford cases and your Eastern establishment Republicans.
Well, and where I came from, Mark Hatfield, Bob Packwood,
right.
My member of Congress, Joel Pritchard, again, a liberal Republican. Mm-hmm. And so, growing up and watching politics, it didn't appear as partisan. And it seemed to be that everyone was trying to do something from a policy perspective, not from a how am I going to get my next job perspective.
To our current moment, where you have the Democrats used to have a few conservative members in the Senate, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, who are no longer at the beginning of the 119th won't be sitting senators. So you've got this polarization. Now the Republicans are far more polarized, farther right on the further right on the ideological spectrum than the Democrats are to the left. But so we're talking about governing at least the budget process by continuing resolution, which is really the only time you see sort of a four-party system, a parliamentary party system emerge, where you've got the center that decide to pass the bill while the extremes on both get to voice their opposition. But with the Hastert rule in the House and forcing everything through the party, basically every meeting vote anymore is to borrow a British phrase, a three-line whip. Mm-hmm. And you either vote with the party. Now, you can't have a whip removed like you can in Parliament, but it's fascinating, because we talk about, is Congress broken? Does Congress function? It functions, but not in the way that we understood it. Even 2008, when Nancy Pelosi first came in, 2006 rather, when Nancy Pelosi was coming in.
Yeah, or even the late 80s, early 90s. The way that we saw it. And obviously there were some important events that happened in there, and certainly Republicans taking over the House after 94, and Gingrich really centralizing power in the Speaker's office, and frankly using the appropriations process as a way to push through big, relatively big policy changes, and coming to mix policy and money spending. Since it's a money spending committee, it always operated well because they didn't get down into policy. Well, you introduce policy into that, and now appropriations bills become, a hot button issue because of the policies that are in there.
Well, so you're in this process, while you took a year off from East Carolina, which I'm sure was an incredible culture shock, to say the least, going from Seattle and Boulder to where's ECU again?
Greenville, North Carolina. In fact, that's a place that Donald Trump likes to go when he's going to have a North Carolina. Yeah, Greenville and Greensboro are two favorite places to go.
So tell me about your teaching and research while you were at ECU in Greenville, North Carolina.
So I went in there and during my first year is when I got the invitation to do the Congressional Fellowship. So I left for a year. My wife is also a political scientist, so we both went to DC. She taught at GW for a year. She had been teaching at Chapel Hill before that. So we went to DC, frankly, with an eye toward moving on to some other place. Then ECU offered her a tenure track position. And so going back to Greenville was an inevitability. And so we went back. A lot of the time there was spent working on leadership-oriented kinds of things. So there's an article about the policy committee. There's one about the Daschle leadership selection that unfortunately never got published. But sort of showing that was a generational sort of change, and I think in retrospect we can now see that was again 1994, 95, that period, and there were some big changes going on, and Daschle was always much more comfortable with the communication side of the Senate, at least early on. Obviously, he turned into a very good parliamentarian, but and that's why Robert Byrd says that he didn't support Daschle the first time around. Was he didn't think that he was going to be good enough with parliamentary stuff, and that Doyle was going to be able to roll him. Yeah, and Daschle certainly picked up his game there. But sort of making this argument, American politics is changing, and his selection is a reflection of that. And I think now, in retrospect, because beginning in the 90s, it all becomes about communication, and to this very day, is a lot about communication and less about policy. The Senate still has relatively decent focus on policy, but in the House, a lot of that seems to have gone by the wayside. But frankly, we were unhappy in Greenville. It was not a place. My wife is from Chicago. I'm from Seattle. Eastern North Carolina is tobacco country. Jesse Helms' stomping ground. And so it was really uncomfortable for us. And so my wife was pregnant and, went on the job market and got the offer at Niagara, which we wound up really loving. Living in Niagara Falls, Western New York, was really, really great. And we didn't have really any intention of moving from there until this became a possibility here at Channel Islands to do a lot of interesting things.
I guess one real positive of your time at ECU was your relationship with Scott Frisch, your colleague, your current, your once and future colleague.
Yeah.
Tell me about that relationship and how that sort of developed into a very fruitful working relationship.
So Scott first interviewed, or he got invited to take a job on a 1-year contract, and he came to visit, which is smart, to see the place, and brought his wife along. So we talked a little bit, and we met, he and Elizabeth, at a local coffee house. And I looked at him and I said, "Don't come here. This is a terrible place. You're going to hate it. You're from New Jersey. You live in California. Don't come here." I said, and then I said, "Is Elizabeth going to come with you to Greenville?" He said, no, she's going to stay back in California. I said, don't come here, because it's a community that's largely organized around a football team and churches. And those are things that, I love football, so I enjoyed the football, but I'm not a churchgoer, and so finding any kind of a social infrastructure there was nearly impossible because you didn't go to church. So I told him not to come, but he came anyway, because that's what you do early in your career. Is somebody offers you a job, you take it. So he came, and over that year, and then the next year he got hired on full time. And at that time, mostly we just sort of talked about, oh, we could do this, and oh, we could do that. And then we left for Niagara Falls, and it wasn't until I was in Niagara Falls that we came together on a project that we could really sink our teeth into.
And that was the committee assignment policy?
Yes, that was the committee assignment stuff, which I hadn't done anything in that area. Scott called me and he said, oh, hey, at the Dirksen Center, they have these letters, and we could do something with this. And my first response, and this is my first introduction to the world of archives, I'm like, they keep that stuff? Are you kidding me? What? Because I had assumed, as secretive as the process is, oh, they burn it like like a papal election or something like that. But no, in fact, they kept all those letters and requests, and as I found out once I got there, even the ballots from the elections of people to take slots on the committees were also there, and they were not anonymous.
That's fairly unique.
Yeah, and I can't say that we have ever found that ever again. However, they were there. So on my first trip to an archive into Bob Michael's papers, I went to Pekin, Illinois, to that place in the public library that they used to have, the small area that they had, and that's really where I began to learn. Frank Mackaman was the first person to show me how to do this. From here's a box, pull out a file, put in a placeholder, one file at a time. The whole 9 yards of doing it. I learned from him. And then as I went through and I found unique things like these envelopes that were sealed with these little votes in them, I'm like, could we open these up? And he opens it up, and I start to think about what we have here is to really get inside of this whole idea of people voting, and that there's competition between different players on the committee to get their people appointed to these committees. And so I spent a good 2.5 days just typing that information in, because making copies would not be possible. So there I am, just typing the stuff in. And Frank said something that resonated with me for the rest of time, which is, he said, I always wondered if those would be useful for anything. And what that taught me was the people who take care of these collections oftentimes know what's in them. And if I can explain what I'm looking for, or at least what I'm doing, that archivists could be really helpful in terms of pointing out, well, you might want to look at this, and you might want to look at that. That is also, to this day, the best organization of a set of congressional papers that I've ever been in. He took real care in putting that together. And so the Michael papers, and I assume I have never used any other papers from that repository, but I assume all the other collections are similarly organized to be really useful to researchers. And as time goes on and I talk to archivists, there's the whole theoretical issue, do it original, what's it called?
Original order.
Yes, original order versus, this idea of imposing order. And learning those little things along the way were incredibly helpful, as I did this more and more. And back then it was very physical. I mean, you had to go to a place in order to be able to get the stuff. There were online finding aids were fairly rare at the time. Maybe they had it in an Excel spreadsheet and could send it to me or something like that. But, you had to go and spend time there, and always risk the possibility that you're not going to find what you're looking for. Luckily, that's either never happened to me or I simply found something interesting nonetheless,
right,
and moved forward with that. So that has been lucky. But yeah, that first trip, I'll never forget it for that. And I'll also never forget it for opening up these folders of letters from members of Congress asking to be on committees, which I assumed at the time would be, I have to be on this committee so I can get reelected, because that's what the literature told us. But as I read those letters, and I probably shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, as I read those letters, they would talk about a lot of things, and talking about constituency was actually less often the case than talking about something else, whether it be policy or, I want to help position us relative to the administration, or, push forward, if it's same party, push forward the president's agenda, those kinds of things. So it was clear that there were more than single motivations going on here. And it's not, people will say, oh, well, they're just making shit up, they're really concerned about reelection. No, I don't think so. I've had people over the years say, well, they don't ask for appropriations because they know that they're not going to get it, so they request something else, but hope that they're going to get, appropriations or whatever it might be. And I said, man, look, when you go to a restaurant, you don't order eggs and hope that you're going to get pancakes. Because, when you're asking a committee like this to help you to do something, when they do it for you, they think they're helping you. So why would you ask for something you don't want in the hope that they're going to give you something that you do want? That makes no sense unless you're thinking about members of Congress as being extremely crafty, you're strategic, yeah, and it's not. It is regular 2D chess.
Sometimes it's checkers.
Yeah, more often than not, probably checkers. Really, much less sophisticated. So that first trip, I'll never forget it. In fact, I still have a box that Frank gave me to cart home all my stuff from the Dirksen Center in my garage, holding one.
Frank, I'm going to email Frank tonight. Let him know. So that's your entree into not just archives, but one of the leading lights of congressional archival community, Frank McAmin. So tell me how that experience and your work and Scott's work sort of opened this door to, the community I live and work in, which is congressional archivists.
As is the way that I work, I got the stuff from the Michael papers, and while I was there, or even maybe before, I started to think, if we're just focusing on Michael, then this is going to have limited interest. So we need to have a slightly better research design. So we should make it, number one, Republicans and Democrats. And right around that time, Tom Foley's papers became available at Washington State, my hometown, or not my hometown, my home state. So of course that
He was a Western Washington.
he was Eastern Washington.
Eastern, excuse me.
Yeah. And so his papers are in Pullman, but I could come through SeaTac and see family and stuff like that. So I did that, and then by the end of that summer, we had both sets of requests, so that our first paper that we could do was, here are the Republicans, here are the Democrats, and guess what? There are differences. Differences that could probably be explained, and later I hope we did explain that, number one, the two parties are different. They have different philosophies. They have different ideas about what is good public policy. And so if we take them at their word, then they should have different interests in different committees. For instance, Ways and Means versus Appropriations. Republicans like Ways and Means better because that has to do with taxes, which they hate. Appropriations is really more attractive to Democrats. And so just that one difference between the two parties is enough to say, okay, maybe we should look at the two parties and compare them to one another. They also use very different selection processes that, produce different outcomes. And so between party differences and institutional differences, we should see some differences between the parties, and we do.
You would expect the same with government affairs and oversight in the judiciary, especially now.
Yeah.
You can do a study of then and now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you absolutely can, and that's why the data basically cover about from the mid-50s into the mid-90s for the book, so that we're getting a good chunk of time there to see, how are things changing. And we have gone back and done a few things with more recent Congresses. I think both of us have different degrees of the same problem, which is we're very curious. We do the work, we get the answer, and then really can't find the commitment to go out and publish it because it's a lot of work. And,
Diminishing returns.
Yeah, right. And the longer you're in your position and you are being promoted and things like that, we don't exist with the same pressures as people at bigger places. And frankly, in retrospect, am really glad about that, because if I had been a junior faculty member at a research-intensive university, I wouldn't have had the 5 or 6 years that it took to bring that project together, because you got to be publishing now. But at the places we were at, there were, reasonable expectations for publishing. We could meet those pretty easily, but at the same time, take months and months and months to collect data, to, code data and do the analysis and all of that. Almost always in the context of teaching 4 classes a semester. It turned out to be something of a gift to wind up at smaller places, because it did give us the space to be able to simply say, yeah, we could try to publish that, or we could move on to the next really interesting thing.
Get your endorphin hit, and then,
Yeah.
and then move on.
Yeah.
So that sort of gets me to a point. So I come out of the historical field. So taking the time and going to archives and going to libraries and sitting in front of microfilm machines is expected. That's why our dissertations, that's why it takes us 7-8 years to do our PhDs and then write the books. And it's a time-consuming process, as you now know.
Yeah.
How do you package and pitch that to your fellow political scientist thinking about the communication side of things,
Yeah.
which you and Scott have done and done yeoman work in that area. But how do you sell archival research to political scientists?
I think mostly by demonstrating that there are good data there.
Yeah.
And when I say data, I mean that you can take qualitative stuff and turn it into numbers. You can also take qualitative stuff and work with it on its own. And you know, our philosophy, separately developed philosophies, are that if we can have numbers and we can have documents and we can have interviews, then the whole thing, the whole structure is going to be much more durable. We'll know, for instance, that we're focusing on the right or wrong variables by asking people who are currently alive, you know, questions like, you know, in our field, the major assumption is that, you know, single-minded seekers of re-election, and just having people kind of go, yeah, no. I mean, yes, it's important, surely, there's no question about it, but there are all these other things that I was interested in trying to accomplish for my constituency, for the country, whatever it might be. So, you know, taking that broader focus on the data in whatever form they come, that's really what the game is all about from our research perspective. You know, is this triangulation? Now, hopefully by demonstrating that to people, they will begin to ask themselves similar kinds of questions. I think that I, not only in research, but in my work here, have been way too dependent on people looking at something and saying, that's a good idea. We should do that. So I have tried to demonstrate and argue, but in the end, oftentimes people look at what you say, oh, that's really cool, but then they don't know where to go from there.
Right.
You know, what do I do? And part of this I chalk up to the fact that it's so often the case that we don't really, and I'm speaking of Congress here in particular, so many people study Congress and yet don't really understand how Congress works. So you wouldn't know what to look for unless you had, you know, seen documents that were similar to that, or, you know, to what you're interested in. And so I think there's a lot of stuff that's sitting out there in boxes that if somebody has the interest, they can go and find them, you know, find the documents, but you really have to understand that, you know, if it's Congress, how does Congress work? If it's the presidency, how does that institution work? You know, so it's partly that. There is a, you know, there is a sort of a cost-benefit curve here also.
Sure.
And that's something that's hard to get people over, you know, that hurdle. So I guess I haven't made as many converts as I had hoped, but by the same token, at least it's still part of the discussion. And I certainly, I don't want to claim there's anything that we did first. You know, there were some really neat articles. A former student of Larry Dodd's, Terry Sullivan, they had done some digging in LBJ's papers going way back and done some stuff on his whipping as president for various policies, you know. So it's been done, but we were just hoping to sort of hold it up a little bit higher, you know. But who's going to do this? Graduate students, they're under a tremendous amount of pressure, probably being advised by people who assume that members of Congress are single-minded seekers of re-election, and you need to find the pivot point if you want to understand Congress. There's a certain truth to that, but not really. And so they're not going to give you really good advice about how to do this, and you have a dissertation that needs to be written. Now you're, first, second, third year junior professor. It's time to start publishing. You don't have time to, start a whole new approach to what it is that you're doing. And so all of the incentives really work against it, which is why I go back to feeling fortunate that I had the time and space to be able to develop that without feeling as though I was going to lose my job. And so I think it's the incentives of most universities that really become a huge barrier to people taking it on. Historians are taught it from the beginning. I kind of had hoped that at some point, some political science program someplace would take advantage and say, we're going to start training people in this from the beginning. Scott and I both bring documents into the undergraduate classroom to show them examples of the things that we're talking about. So it has value for teaching, but it could have value for research. And especially because a lot of universities, big ones with graduate programs, have oftentimes extensive political papers collections. For instance, the University of Georgia. Why, and I don't know if they do or they don't, but why not have one of those first year seminars, maybe focused on Congress, where you go and you use the Richard Russell papers, which is a collection that I've used remotely, but used it. Why not have a class that's built that way as a kind of a research approach, so that you can at least give graduate students, a taste of what this might be like and how to do the basic navigational things. And I haven't seen it happen, and I think it would take, because what faculty member is going to say, oh, you know what, I'm going to start from scratch and put together a class like this. It really needs to be that marriage of somebody who has the interest with the opportunity. And we have a small collection here, unprocessed collection, that I have used with freshman students.
Yeah.
And literally taking them into the basement and pulling boxes off of shelves to track things down, and students do find a certain fascination in it. This guy's name is Biz Johnson, there's really good, interesting stuff, like in constituent correspondence, which I don't spend a lot of time with, but what people were writing in 1968 about civil rights took some students aback.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's just a good opportunity, or reading letters about Watergate and what the person thinks about Watergate. And all we would do is say, here's a letter from a person. Try to take this letter. What is ambiguous to you, and what does it, what is Watergate? Because don't forget, it's almost 50 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
It is 50 years ago.
Everything's a gate, but the students don't necessarily know why it's a gate.
So what does that mean? What was Watergate? And impeachment, what does impeachment mean? And that kind of thing, to try to take apart some of those things to get them, beginning to think in terms of research rather than thinking, as so many freshmen do, that it's, memorize the book and answer the questions on the test, which of course is the style of education that pushed me out of high school. It's not what I want to do. So we have our small ragtag fugitive fleet of individuals out there who are doing some of this work, and lo and behold, oftentimes at small universities. So I think there's something to be said for that.
What interventions or innovations do you think would be required either from the archival side and or the political science side to sort of lower those barriers to access, to encourage use among a broader array of scholars?
I have a saying, political scientists are lazy. And I say that because, there are lots and lots of data sets on the internet that you can download very quickly and start working with. And so, and getting the data is oftentimes the most difficult part. So if you can do that, why not just do that? Because that takes you down the path of least resistance. I think it's going to take, unfortunately, a whole lot of digitized stuff so that people can sit in their office and download documents, that have already been digitized. One of the things that people are surprised to hear, not me, but just ordinary folks, is that 99.99% of the stuff is not digitized and probably never will be. As long as that's the case, there will be a lot of, lazy people. And I count myself among the lazy in any number of ways. But when you tell somebody, hey, you've got to go and do this, now incentives like reaching them early in their graduate career, thinking about some kind of an archival research symposium as an integral part of preparation, maybe for some, I only do American politics, so I don't know. But if you're somebody who's interested in the courts, in the presidency, in Congress, in interest groups, whatever it might be, let's bring you into a kind of a seminar, and part of it can be, sort of research designy, and then the other part is how do we access the information from the repository that we have at hand, say at a place like Georgia where you would have a wide variety of things that you could look at, so let's go over there, find the data that we need, and try to put something together that is more interesting than your average first year political science project, which is oftentimes 27 articles and 13 books, and you're just saying, oh, here's what all the people said about these things, it's useful, but it's not particularly interesting. Whereas you can go across the quad, pull a file, and have a quote from whomever, Richard Russell or whoever, illustrating a point that either is or isn't reflected in the literature. That to me is really exciting, because that's where knowledge is being created, is there. What it would take that, and I think also probably some small programs that would provide incentives to do that kind of thing. I often thought that I think of Oklahoma because of the Albert collections there, but a university like Oklahoma or Georgia or Texas or whatever, doing like a 1 week thing like ICPSR does for quantitative research, only this is sort of qualitative research, for lack of a better term. That archival research on site with other people who are interested, and that students would come for a week and engage the process, and hopefully you're able to invite in enough faculty, either from that campus or elsewhere, to sort of provide the mentorship that could be useful. We all have our teachers. Frank was a good teacher for me. I was already, a number of years along in my career, so I absorbed that a lot faster. But I think getting that in at the graduate level would be really helpful. And then having, maybe it's a 1 week seminar that moves from, to several different universities year by year, as a way of exploring different collections and drawing different faculty and different students and things like that. That of course hasn't happened either, and I think it takes somebody who, is sort of dumb like me, who spends a lot of time trying to figure out, well, how can I help other people to do these things, as opposed to how can I help myself to do these things. I'm not as selfless as that sounds, but relatively open to saying, okay, I can set my own interests aside here because there's a larger project, which is to try to get people into this stuff.
So it's if I'm hearing this correctly, it's this impulse, it's your background, it's your relationship with the Congressional Papers section, Frank, and the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. Were these the conversations and everything that goes into the writing of doing archival research in political science?
Yeah.
Was that sort of a culminating project?
Yeah, it was. So ACSC, I think I went to the first meeting. If it wasn't the first one, it was the second one.
Okay.
At the Wilson Center in DC, and I kind of stumbled into it. Larry Dodd was a fellow at the Wilson Center that year, and I think he brought my attention to it, said they're going to be meeting here. I'm going to be part of the meeting, so why don't you come down and just come to the meeting. And what I found, first of all, is that archivists are almost always really nice people, and there seemed to be a thirst to speak to users, which I think is really, really good, because from the perspective of a user, I think archives should be built around the idea of users and getting used. And so I found them very open to the ideas and willing to help. I know that it was maybe a year or two after that, we did an APSA short course. So the archivists were all in for helping us on that. And at least one person who went to that has told me years after the fact that it was a really important experience for him, and he turned around and started doing archival stuff. Another guy at a small place, but nonetheless. And so I became active in the organization for several years, and mostly, backing off just because, in part, this job for a lot of years took a lot of energy. This is a new university, relatively new now, and there were a lot of things that needed to be done, and I figured I was the person who needed to do them. In retrospect, that may have been silly of me, but so I did start to get pulled away that way. But we did get the one volume done, and I was super happy about that, because there are a few people out there who are using these resources, and the whole idea behind the book was to try to demonstrate the different topics and different ways just in American politics that you could study parties or interest groups or whatever it might be. So I get, in a way, I'm a little too subtle in that I like to push things, you might want to look at this here, and people not always getting that I'm saying, look at this. You need to follow this. You need to pay attention to this. But I'm also not a person who really imposes myself on others, so I may not be the best salesman in that regard. But tried to put it out there as much as I could, and I think with some modest success. I guess I wanted to change the field, and fell short on that one. But,
There's still time, as you said.
Yeah, and who knows?
The night is young.
Yeah, who knows?
Well, that book was published 12 or so years ago now.
Yeah.
Over the the past decade or so, what changes do you think, or additions? Say there's a second revised edition. What do you think you would do differently, or whose voices might you try to incorporate that maybe weren't in the first volume?
I honestly don't know, because I don't see a lot of stuff being done. And I didn't want to reach out to historians because they've already they got the good news, and so it's really tough to know what I would like to see more people doing stuff with interest groups. I have not seen a lot of that. And in political science, a lot of this, a lot of the material, the texture is pulled out of the New York Times, the Washington Post, that kind of thing, which I was criticized for earlier in my career. When there are things that are far more expansive within a collection, that can give you a much better idea of what was going on at that time than any reporting can. And of course, that's nothing against reporters. They're working with what they got. But the ability to go back and really take a second look at that, because the newspapers aren't always right.
It's the first draft of history.
Yeah, exactly. It's the first draft, and it's very rough. But it's oftentimes taken as, well, that's the history right there. So you have scholars who, say, sift through the New York Times and collect their data from there, when there could be a much more definitive data source if you bother to go look for it. Because those reporters don't know everything that's going on in Congress at any given point in time. It's a very complex organization, but it's still being captured one way or another on a page or a virtual page or whatever it might be. That stuff is being captured at a much more granular level, and so taking the time, so the Jimmy Carter stuff. There was the lore of Jimmy Carter. He was, he became president in '77. I was 12 years old. That was about the time I was waking up to politics in that kind of a way. And he certainly had developed a reputation by the time I hit college and after as an ineffective leader and all this kind of stuff. And so I was carried around with me because, well, that's what everybody says. And yet when we got into looking at his vetoing of a piece of legislation and then working to make sure that the veto was sustained, that there was a lot there that said, oh, hey, wait a minute. Jimmy Carter, and more importantly, sort of the Carter administration, was much better at doing these things than a lot of people gave it credit for. And so we put together a book that wound up, it's, I guess, not negative or positive on Carter himself, but on the imagination of who Jimmy Carter was, and what he did or didn't accomplish, and why he didn't do those things. So looking at their whip counts and their their memos about why are we going to veto this particular bill. Those kinds of things, they add so much more that you wouldn't get in a newspaper article. It just wouldn't be there, for any number of reasons. And so that that little book in itself was a kind of a little revelation. Really, that's the only really kind of presidency centric, and even then it's half about
even then
Congress.
that's not really, because so much of what you're talking about is Danny Tate, who was Jimmy Carter's Senate liaison, and who would come out of Herman Talmadge's office, and Jimmy Carter and Ham Jordan and Joey Powell, the Georgia Mafia, don't necessarily know how the ways of Washington, and snubbing Tip O'Neill at the Kennedy Center and stuff like that. But Danny Tate and coming out of Herman Talmadge's office certainly knows how the Senate works. Senate Finance and Ag, and those are the people that in that one overarching Carter myth. Carter the Rube, Carter the Hayseed, Carter the I can't tell a lie, gee shucks. I'm gonna get played. That's we can argue all day about sort of his tone, which I think gets picked up more if you're just looking at the New York Times and the Washington Post, rather than as you're saying.
And that's a really good example. So a lot of people would come at that particular project from the point of view of Carter and the Carter White House. And yet what we were able to do is also come at it from the point of view of Congress. So Tom Bevel, who was the chair of the subcommittee whose bill was vetoed, also had a real interest in seeing this veto overturned. And so at the University of Alabama, so I had gone to the Stennis papers, and it was a little disappointing. I knew I had maybe a half a day going back, and I would go right by the University of Alabama, and I had remembered that I was looking at some Bevel stuff earlier, and he had some stuff on this veto. So on my way back through, I stopped there for a half a day and got all of that stuff copied. So now we have the whip counts from the White House and the whip counts from the guy who was managing the House, so that we could really get at that issue of who wins. Even Frank Moore, who ran the liaison office, said in his oral histories, well, if you're going up against the chairman of the committee, who's going to win? It's the chairman. Well, in fact, it turned out to be the opposite, that Carter not only beat Bevel, but he beat Bevel when Bevel was lobbying other members of Congress. So the president's voice was heard by people and changed their minds. And how do you get at that any other way? You could look at just people who switched their votes, but you wouldn't know who did the president call, who did Bevel call, that kind of stuff. So some ideology measures, party ID, that kind of stuff, and but it was so much more complex than that, as politics often is.
Right. Yeah. When you do those ideological scores, or you look at the correlates and you see the outliers, and that just raises the question: well, why these folks?
Yeah.
Well,
it could be that. It could be any number of variables, even that people oftentimes don't think about, like people who are retiring. And that the White House made a special effort to reach out to people who were retiring in order to get those votes. that speaks to me of a much more elegant kind of a process than to say, oh, well, this person voted this way because they're a Democrat. There may be more to that story.
Is it putting too fine a point on it, or mischaracterization of your approach to political science, to say that you are doing your best to wed the social sciences with the humanities?
Yeah.
Or at least bringing humanity back into political science?
Yeah. I mean, I think at the bottom of it all, that is precisely it. And when I think back, even as far as graduate school, that I had Larry Dodd, who's very much a sort of a theoretical and much more humanistic approach, and then Walt Stone. And literally, my office was between these two. Walt Stone, who's a behaviorist, survey research, stuff like that, and that in the end, what I tried to do was sort of balance out those two impulses. I love, taking that sort of humanistic, historical kind of approach, but I'm also really into numbers and being analytical about things. And so, yeah, in a way, I could say yes, because I want to return to members of Congress their basic humanity. To be boiled down to somebody who's only interested in, one thing, getting reelected, or one thing, serving your constituents, I mean, that doesn't reflect most any person I know in real life. Most people aren't all that calculating or omniscient. And so sort of returning to that idea of the politician as, something more human, I think is really important, or we're going to ultimately misunderstand how the institution is working. And I got a comment on a conference panel once that was pointing out the differences between Democrats and Republicans. And this very senior scholar afterwards, he said, we really need to look into these Republicans and find out why they're not acting the right way. Interesting, because the whole point of the paper is that they might act differently because they have different goals, different policy goals, different career
tells
goals.
us they should act like this.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And a lot of those models, frankly, is another very senior, very well-known student of Congress who once he finally said the quiet part out loud. He said, I hate politics. And he was in it to study things that were more sort of strategic. And he hated politics because he couldn't remember who were all the people, the names of all the House members and all this kind of
He's
stuff.
a game strategist who needs to find a new game.
Yeah. And when he said that, I had told Scott this before this meeting, and Scott happened to be there, and this guy said this thing, and I turned to Scott and I said, I told you so. That there are brands of political scientists, and they're lovely people, and they do great work, and I have all the respect in the world for them, but their focus is oftentimes just that politics is something that I can use as my data source for testing this larger theory about how people behave, and you can definitely I actually love rational choice theory. I find it to be extremely elegant and oftentimes having really neat insights. However, when you start to believe your own models, then you're not really understanding the thing that you're studying. It almost becomes, an exercise in just proving that you're right, using anecdotes to show that you are correct, which is not how this is supposed to work.
Which is the complete inverse of what
Yeah.
political science is. That's the criticism of history.
Yeah.
From the political.
Yeah, but
I have a
there's
series of anecdotes and letters.
there is a for them it's I have a series of stories about this thing that happened, Arrow's paradox. I was just thinking about it the other day for no reason in particular, and it's like, this is a really cool idea that you can't ever get a majority for anything, and so you're going to produce these cycles. And then the question for political science becomes, well, why don't you see these cycles all the time? And the answer is actually pretty simple, but they continue looking for the example of this thing happening, and it doesn't happen, but not anywhere near the reasons that you think it doesn't happen.
It's like when you've got the model and time and the evidence has moved on, but the whole upshot of the articles and books are all the deviations from the model and why this case didn't work and this case didn't work well. When you've got that many deviations and you've got that many, maybe it's time to reassess the model, right?
Yeah.
You have that many exceptions to the rule.
Yeah.
It's time for a new rule.
Yeah.
But that's neither here nor there. Well, what's it going to take to get you and Scott and you West Coast folks more, to re-engage and get back involved in the archival community?
Yeah. Well, I guess a de-aging machine would be nice. There's that, because you get to a point and you're starting to think about retirement and things like that, and so that's part of it. But I think what could really get me energized again is just this idea that we're going to find some students who are willing to take the leap of giving this a try, and that's the thing where I'm more than happy to be part of something like that. So give me $1 million, and enough time, and we could do that sort of thing. I am involved in the West Virginia the digitization portal project. I kind of hope that maybe something like that, if we have enough digital stuff out there, that lazy political scientists will look at it and then go, oh, hey, there might be more here. So what do you mean I have to?
The first hit is free.
Yeah, exactly. Get them hooked if possible.
A little off color, but
yeah. And try to get them hooked that way. I worry sometimes that the focus of these projects oftentimes winds up being K-12 because, K-12 education needs a lot of help, and this would be a good way to teach students any number of things, and I agree with all of that. But oftentimes then you're letting alone undergraduate education or graduate education, which is where the stuff is going to be replicated and it's going to be used. So I'm fully in favor of engaging the younger set in this stuff, because I think it can be quite powerful. But how do we get sort of more academic-minded people involved in that? And I really think over the years we applied for a couple of grants to try to make this kind of thing take off, and who knows why you get turned down for grants, but CSU Channel Islands is not a household name to be putting on, it potentially could be very fun with people who have more energy than I do now. I used to have a lot of energy.
Kids, I used to be fun.
Yeah.
I used to have fun myself. Well, there's definitely a lot of food for thought here, and I think there is, at least, within the ACSC partner schools, hunger to do more of these projects that sort of bring us all together, that sort of, pooling the resources, able to pull in congressionally directed spending, maybe not for a cheese factory on the moon, but for a congressional portal project. Probably be a little bit more for the cheese factory, but I'm here for it.
Yeah, I think one partnership, I don't know if I ever tried to sell this or not, but there is an annual Congress and History conference.
Yes.
And ACSC getting involved somehow with, maybe it's a pitch, or I don't know exactly what format it would be in, but has tended to draw, I've only gone once, but it's tended to draw really notable individuals and the kinds of people who were involved in graduate education, and maybe they would find some value in that. I forget where it is this year. I think it's at Brown this year.
Who doesn't love Providence for that?
I've only been there once.
I've been there once.
I thought it was pretty cool.
It's a little chilly when I went, but
but doing something and going in there, hopefully with the cooperation of the people at Brown, and saying, let's look at your collections. What could we pull out of your collections to be able to use to put people in a room, to be able to actually, sort of paw through this stuff, to see what they might be able to find and try to whet the appetite that way. So that is a possibility also, and it would be, relatively low cost because, you already have the facility, you have the papers there and all of that. It's hard to talk archivists into allowing people to simply paw through a bunch of stuff, but the point would be to provide some, some initial training on how not to put these things out of order, all that kind of stuff that you could do, but also find some of the most compelling stuff and bring that to the table literally, so that people could actually engage it. And then maybe maybe the discussion turns to, okay, you're at Vanderbilt, what collections are at Vanderbilt, and is there anything that's connected to the kinds of things you're interested in there? So that, and I think we did the one short course at APSA, and then we thought about doing another one. It might have been screwed over by COVID. But anyway, there have been talks on several occasions about doing another one. But it would have to, I think that part of it has to be that going through and actually seeing for yourself. Otherwise, it's just an abstract idea.
Right.